A communication strategy is something that is critically important in that because of the stigma that's out there, it's important that people have permission to be able to talk about this. I have Rick Warren's picture up there because his family in particular has done some really fabulous things in publicly processing some of the things that they went through after their adult son committed suicide. That has made it very, very clear that folks who are struggling with these issues are very much loved by God and very much welcome as a part of their congregation. So that to the extent that you can talk about this or find ways of communicating about your ministry on a Sunday morning, again, sort of the public platforms, the people who get up to talk, that those are oftentimes a very short supply on Sunday. But making sure that if you have a support group going on, or if you're able to welcome kids, or have small group options for people, making sure that's in the church bulletin. Making sure that people are aware from looking at your church's website or your Facebook page that you are very much welcoming of folks who have these struggles, say by like some of the things that you post and share. So we know that there are churches that share stuff that we publish on our blog. There are a number of like-minded ministries that do really excellent work. And if you want to email me, that there are, and we'll talk about some of them in the course of the day-to-day, that there are lots of things that people could follow on Facebook and share and put up on a church Facebook page, or through your Twitter, or through your Pinterest, or through your Instagram, that become very easy things for your membership then to share with families that they know who are outside of the church who are struggling. One thing that we've been wrestling with a little bit, and I'm looking for a place to try and do something like this, is to actually create some sort of an inclusion concierge, and to have a way for people who are, and we might label it like introverts, to be able through like one click or email to connect with somebody at the church who could help them work through struggles that they would have with a first-time experience, or struggles that their child would have with a first-time experience. So for example, one of the things that's very helpful for kids who are anxious is the opportunity to see as much as possible of what they are going to be experiencing before they try something new for the first time. So that there are a lot of kids that the ability to, to be able to visit a church on a Sunday not on a Sunday morning, when it's quiet, so that they would know their way around. They would know what to expect. Someone to help that mom with social anxiety get her kids registered for everything that they need to be registered for. Someone who would be able to help make connections, for example, for families who are looking to get into a small group, to find an experience that would be friendly for their kid or teen that would be friendly for them. Having someone within your team who could take on that responsibility and help folks get connected is something potentially that would be very beneficial. Now, this is what I call casserole therapy. And there was an interesting segment. This is last year on 60 Minutes. And they were doing an investigative report on the experience that families had going to a when their kid was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. And one of the comments that one of the moms made that resonated is that, when your kid breaks a leg or when somebody has surgery, people bring you casseroles. When it is a brain-based disorder, nobody brings you casseroles. And so one way of eliminating some of the stigma would be to take a look at helping ministries you're already doing, and making sure that as folks, you become aware of folks with some of these issues, that you reach out and include them in those efforts to help. One of the things that's a big challenge for those of you, and I suspect because of the topic today that there may be some folks here who they themselves have had an experience of this or have a kid with this. It's really hard to find help. And I know, like, even here in a large city like Louisville, I'm sure that resources are fairly limited. Having folks tied into your team who can help refer families for help Where can you go when your kid is threatening to kill themselves? Where do you go when someone is anxious or depressed and can't sleep? Where do you go if you have a child who's been adopted and is acting that out, or there's some question about trauma or maybe some attachment issues? Helping people to kind of find the right place to go is an important service. Being able to provide high quality counseling either at low cost or, in the case of our church, no cost, is something that's oftentimes a blessing. A couple of ways of doing this that without necessarily calling attention to it that would work is that if your church got involved with doing like tutoring or mentoring through a local school, you would find an overrepresentation of kids who struggle with this in the group of kids who need to be tutored. So that would be one way of providing a service without telling anybody you're providing a service and trying to form relationships. Another really vital service, and that this could be a place where if you have like retired teachers or folks who are educators in your school, a big struggle for a lot of our families is when they have to go into the school and they have what we call IEP or 504 meetings to get accommodations for their kids, or if they need some sort of specialized service. Having people who understand how the system works and can come alongside them and go with them to these meetings and advocate for them, it would be a really neat service that you can make available to the community that would bring you into relationship with other families who are struggling with some of these kinds of issues. Now, advancing the kingdom through coffee and donuts. Grace groups. There are a few different organizations that are developing some resources specifically for churches in terms of mental health education. Mental Health Grace Alliance is a fabulous group. They are based in Waco, Texas, and it was started by a pastor and a psychologist who was on a faculty at Baylor. And they offer several different types of church-based groups. I think they're now in probably like 12 or 13 states in Canada that churches can offer. There's a family group. There's a group for mental health for mental health support for adults, and they've started a model for doing trauma groups for adults, that are offered free of charge at churches around the country. So making yourselves available to do that. The NAMI, National Alliance for Mental Illness, has different time-limited groups, peer-to-peer, family-to-family. There's also a wing of NAMI called FaithNet that exists specifically to work with, to work with congregations and religious-based organizations to help with education and outreach and support. Fresh Hope is a new ministry that has been developed for churches to help provide support for adults who have mood issues. And then there are different diagnostic-specific support groups that some churches house. For example, support groups like through the Autism Society. CHAD is a nationwide organization that offers support to families who are dealing with ADHD. And then, finally, part of what a good inclusion ministry does is that it empowers the people of the church to be the church wherever they've been placed and to be able to respond to immediate needs. Libby from our board, who was on staff at our church, wrote an article for our blog one time called "She Grabbed a Mop." And so that she was going to visit a family in the church where they knew that they were struggling with a daughter who had some pretty serious mental health issues. What the mom needed the most was somebody to help her to clean her floors. So Libby grabbed a bucket, grabbed a mop, and just, shared, and they talked as they were kind of like, serving alongside one another in that way. One of the things that our church started doing was they offered what we call relational respite. So they, small groups are a big thing, so that they encouraged each small group in the church to adopt one family with one kid with a disability. And then twice a month, a couple from that group will go to the family's house to provide respite in an environment in which the child is most familiar. And the neat thing about that is it formed connections between sort of the families impacted by disability. It got them woven and included in the relational fabric of the church. One of the things that several of our churches do, who do group respite events on a church campus, is they put business cards for people to invite in their church bulletin. They tell them, like, keep them in your wallet, so if you see a kid at Walmart, in line who's having issues, or you see a family that's in distress, feel free to go ahead and give them one of those and invite them to go and, check that out if that's something that parents need to have a break. One of the most important things that folks need, though, is just presence. That you think back to like the story of Job, and his friends were screw ups because of like telling him some things that about God that weren't necessarily true. But a lot of times, one of the things that folks most need, kids most need, families most need, is that somebody just spend time with them and do life with them. And you don't need a degree, and you don't need any special training from us, if you're going to a church, to be able to do that. We're happy to, give you any background information that you need, but just taking the time to be with is a big part of being the church. So how do we start tying this together? And, in terms of closing today, how do we think about some specific interventions that might help? For social isolation, here are a few. Our churches that do respite in the networks that we've set up typically will include siblings at the respite events, because what good is respite if you still have to find a babysitter for your other kids? The other thing that they do is that everybody gets a buddy, regardless of whether or not they're, quote unquote, typical, or whether they're kids who have a disability. And by doing it that way, we found that the majority of kids that we were serving were kids who actually had primary mental health concerns. Because they could go to that, and because nobody knew whether they were the ones who needed the buddy or whether they were a sibling, things are just fine. Besides, they're more than happy to throw their brother or sister under the bus and to claim that they're the ones who have issues. If you know that there are neighbors who are struggling with some of this stuff, because like taking their kids to therapy appointments in the afternoon, offering to do pickup, for the quote unquote typical sibling, after basketball practice or after wrestling practice or after dance practice, is something that can be helpful. If you know that someone has a kid who's struggling socially, inviting them to your house for a play date with your kids is something that will meet a very tangible need. And then if you're doing any kind of online worship, I'd be very happy to talk to you. If you make your sermon videos available online, we're hiring the woman from Life Church TV who did all their online advertising to look at specific techniques and to develop keywords and a strategy for being able to communicate this back out to families in your community with disability. So we could talk about how you can take the stuff that you're already doing online and maybe using it to try and reach a larger audience of families with disability. Now, those who struggle with social communication, those who struggle with anxiety, we talked about the importance of partnering with parents, that the parents are the ones who can oftentimes communicate the best. Looking and doing a survey of your ministry space to make sure that your spaces are sensory friendly to as great a degree as possible. And again, a lot of times with little money or no money, painting some things differently, taking some things down off the walls, looking at what the volume settings are when the music is being played at your worship, and looking at some things that you're doing from a lighting standpoint. You can inexpensively create environments that will help a lot more folks to feel more included. Identify maybe some friendly small groups, or if you can't train all your small group leaders, maybe you could train one or two of your youth group leaders to be more sensitive and to be able to include older kids and include teens in group activities where that's an important part of what your church does. A big thing that your children's ministry folks can start, and you can do this at every level of ministry, is awareness about bullying. And how important from a Christian witness standpoint it is for kids who are identified with church to be kind to other kids. And then the other thing to think about here is that there are a lot of churches that have sort of a one-size-fits-all view of discipleship. In that, we want everybody to do the same stuff, but God created us differently, so I'm not sure that necessarily works for 100% of people. So thinking about like some alternate alternative paths for discipleship. And for folks, and some of these like really bright kids who struggle with social communication, one-on-one kind of mentoring might work better for some of them than having them be a part of a small group. Or if they could serve alongside some people in the church who could be, mentors to them and role models to them, that would oftentimes be something that people would find very helpful. Now, the anxiety thing. As much preparation as you can do for their first visit, that's likely to be something that's helpful. Now, again, as we talked, people with anxiety overestimate the level of risk in new situations. So one place technology can help us is that just about everybody, before they go visit a new church, checks out that church's website nowadays. If you have kids, or if you have families coming, the more pictures you have on the website that will show kids and parents what kids will be doing in your ministry, the more video you have to show them what they'll be doing. Or another struggle that we see sometimes, and I'm going to talk about this later in the breakout session. I had a kid in my office who was having a meltdown, a 6th grader. He goes to church every week and sits with his family, but can't do middle school ministry. Mom put her foot down and decided he would go to the overnight middle school retreat, and he has separation anxiety. And they ended up having a rage reaction at home where objects got thrown and some things got broken. If you wanted him to go on that middle school retreat, one of the things that would have made it easier would have been if they had video he could have watched at what happened at last year's middle school retreat. Pictures of where he was going to sleep, who he was going to sleep with, what he would be eating, what kind of activities they would be having during the middle school retreat, what kind of clothes did he need to pack, what did he need to bring along with. In someone who's anxious, where they worry about all of that kind of stuff, the more that we can do to kind of fill in the blanks for folks who struggle with this, the easier it is, to be able to help them to get over that hurdle. One other things that you want to be careful about doing, and we may talk about this a little bit later in terms of like what you put on forms, is you want to be very careful about drawing attention to kids who are self-conscious. My oldest daughter is very involved with their campus ministry now in Chicago. Goes downtown one night a week, is feeding and building relationships with people who are homeless, leading Bible studies and stuff. She served in the preschool ministry at our church for 6 years. And beginning middle school, she taught, the 3s and 4s. There was one day that she went into middle school worship, large group, and parents were late. The sermon ran over, and so she was going to that during second service, and so she was late getting there, and slipped into the back row and sat in the back. The church we were going to at the time, the very well-meaning middle school pastor, from the microphone up on the platform said, "Leah's sitting alone. We need to do something about this." She could not go, she never diagnosed with anything. She couldn't go back to large group worship unless she knew that she had a friend to walk in with her and sit with her so that wouldn't happen again. And there was a time, it was time for worship to, the second service to start. We couldn't find her. I found her sitting in a corner in the church crying, texting friends to see if anybody she knew was coming because of something that was a seemingly innocuous response. So that thinking about, for example, let's say you have a kid with dyslexia who's anxious, and kids are taking turns going around the room reading a Bible verse. Is there a way that you could have a certain color-coded name tag or something innocuous that the teachers or the group leaders could see that you shouldn't call on that kid, when, in a situation where they might feel uncomfortable? Kids who struggle with emotions and behavior. Again, friendly physical environments. Something to think about with kids is if you had a lot of them who are like this, how do you sequence what you do on a Sunday morning? Because sometimes kids, if they're involved in a high energy activity, have a very hard time settling down after that. you might want to think about having the lower key stuff first and then doing your praise and worship at the end if you have a lot of kids who have this type of struggle, because they'll have an easier time self-regulating during the smaller group parts of the program where you have untrained people working on teaching them. Other things that are an issue: transition times and making sure that those times are adequately staffed. I had a kid, he's in college now, but his family started going to church, and the group leaders would split, and the church that they were going to encourage people to sort of stay, hang out, talk to one another in the lobby. Well, nobody was monitoring the children's ministry area. And this is a kid who was anxious, who, like the third or fourth time he was there, after all the grown-ups left and before his parents picked him up, an older kid started wrestling with him, and he had carpet burns across both sides of his face when he came into our office because this kid had shoved his face, into the carpeting on the floor, and there wasn't anybody watching. So that the times that are most noisy, most chaotic, with the least adult supervision are the times that they are most likely to have a problem. So you need to staff for that and prepare for it. Some of these kids are better with physical activity or movement. I remember going to the middle school parents orientation at the church we were attending at the time, and one of the volunteers was complaining about the problem that they had with 9 boys who all had ADHD, a number of whom, let's just say, I happen to know professionally, where they were having a very hard time with the small group component of the program. Well, you can't expect 7th grade boys with ADHD at 7:30 on a Sunday night after their medicine's worn off to sit around in a small group on these chairs and have a discussion for an hour. So that my remedy to them was to have your group leaders take them to the food bank and have them talk about the lesson while they're loading trucks. So that for some of these kids, being involved with something where there's some physical activity involved will make a difference. With regard to sensory processing issue, we talked about having some sensory-friendly areas. Looking at, how you're using lighting, the volume of sound, how you're using color. Some kids who have sensory issues may need some alternative activities. A lot of these kids will also have fine motor issues. And so that, like, making the craft in some instances, if it's something that requires a lot of attention to detail, might be a struggle. So having some other sort of alternative or backup activities for kids who may have trouble processing that would be something that's an issue. The stigma thing. Talk about it on Sunday morning. Encourage people in the church to share their stories. A lot of times, because 21% of pastors have issues with depression. A lot of times, having somebody on staff self-disclose if they're comfortable with doing that is a great way of giving other people in the church permission to talk about it. Sharing helpful links or resources or articles through your social media is helpful. And if you do any kind of support groups, it's like, hanging out a welcome banner to people in your community that, your church is a place where they and their kids will be welcomed. So part of what we've been talking about doing is we've been looking at interventions in terms of looking specifically at environments that would help everybody, regardless of whether or not they have a specific diagnosis. Thinking about ways of, like on your registration form, is there anything that you have found especially helpful at home for those who serve your child if they become upset or distracted? And phrasing something in a way like that where they don't have to identify a diagnosis, but it's the parent kind of coming alongside and helping. Here's some ideas that help us to communicate most effectively. And one of the things that we've seen a lot of churches do is have the notion of floating buddies. So that they might have a couple of people on any given Sunday morning connected to their children's ministry who would be able to come in and lend some additional support. Like in public schools, they talk about the notion of a shared aid, where you might have one person in a hot button classroom where there are 3 or 4 kids who occasionally need some extra help. We can do the same thing here, and we don't necessarily have to tell the parents that they're identified or that their child's identified as needing something different. It's just an additional support then for the teacher in the classroom. Including kids when parents have mental health concerns. Look at your inconsistent attenders. Look at ways of having those parents get connected relationally with other folks inside the church. Think about ways of using technology. I know like a lot of our teachers use these like different texting systems now where they can send a text out to everybody. It would be easy enough to go ahead and set something like that up where your children's ministry folks or your Sunday school folks could send a blast text out like reminding parents, here was a verse that we were working on last week, you know, sorry we missed some of you, we'd be delighted to see you again this coming Sunday. You know, think about ways for people who tend to be forgetful and disorganized to help the parents who are that way to remember to come. You know, and keep in mind that, you know, being in community helps greatly with accountability. Okay, so here's the bottom line. If you think about kids with mental illness and families who have kids with mental illness, this is the ultimate low-hanging fruit for outreach for any given local church. I mean, if you look at the numbers, I would guess that there are literally hundreds of families, you know, within a 5-minute radius here at Christ Church who aren't able to do church because they have kids with these issues or there are parents who are struggling with these issues. You know, if you're looking at, you know, trying to grow the church and sharing the gospel with other people, this in my mind is a complete no-brainer. You know, I like my ESPN 360. You probably figured out I'm kind of a technology fan. You know, so like, you know, my wife, you know, I'll go anywhere with you, like, you know, with ministry as long as there's a Nordstrom there. You know, we're not into like, you know, the third world country kind of thing and stuff like that. You don't have to go to a third world country to find people who need Jesus. They're right next door. And this is a way of thinking about how to go ahead and reach them. We're talking about a mindset as opposed to a program. So that, you know, you can take any one of these, you know, any one of these obstacles today, start with one. You can start with one of the strategies today. And it's thinking about how do we include kids and families in the stuff that we already do. If I were going to focus on 2 specific barriers, I would focus on the barriers to people getting connected in your church and folks being able to communicate with people who are in your church. I would look at my ministry environments and design them in such a way that they are engaging without being overwhelming. And I would remind you that, you know, Jesus is Jesus, we're not. We can't do everything. Your church isn't going to be able to do everything. But in the same way that Sarah talked about your Lego blocks and thinking about one kid or one family when you're putting the Lego blocks together, I want you to start by thinking about one kid and one family as you put your mental health inclusion ministry together.